It was the new year in Havana, Cuba, January 1st, 1959. And something had happened that would change global and Western politics for at least the next 40 to 50 years. It would spark a bevy of secret operations and perhaps the most failed attempts by the U.S. to assassinate any one man. Ladies and gentlemen, the event I'm talking about is, of course, the Cuban Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, today on this episode of Uprising, we're going to be talking a little bit about one of, actually a failed uprising, and a completely, really manufactured uprising that turned out to be disastrous for the United States of America and quite beneficial for Cuba. And that is, of course, the Bay of Pigs. And the reason I start with January 1, 1959 is we're going to take you all up. We're going to lead you through these events. And we got to start here in the beginning of this story, because we're going to trace on today's episode, the network of intelligence connections and behind-the-scenes planning of what we know went on from January 1st, 1959, all the way up to that fateful two-day April stretch from April 17th, 1961 to April 19th, 1961, where, of course, the invasion took place. And, of course, it obviously starts with the man Fidel Castro succeeding in forcing General Fulgencio Batista into exile. Fidel Castro gives a victory speech from Santiago. This new revolution, he states, will not be like 1898, where North Americans came and made themselves masters of our country. Really, this was in a large part an effort that really, at least you can debate the history of the whole Cuban Revolution, but in large part, it did succeed with a heavy dose of dislike of foreign rule and North American rule, and really wanted to set out on its own as a representative of the global South, which is something that they, I would argue, did do, and was a big, big driving force, at least at the beginning of the election. The Cuban Revolution, the Cuban Castro reign. So on January 7th, 1959, Washington officially recognizes the new government. In a memo to the President John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State says the provisional government appears free from communist taint, and there are indications that it intends to pursue friendly relations with the United States. Early the next day, Castro's victory caravan finally reaches Havana, and the new regime takes charge. So you may be thinking, communist taint? What? That doesn't seem like that sounds like Castro has a lot of communist taint. During Fidel Castro's post-revolution trip to Washington, he actually met with the vice president at the time, Richard Nixon, for 3.5 hours, saying, quote, "I spent as much time as I could, trying to emphasize that he had a great gift of leadership, but that it was the responsibility of a leader to not always follow the public opinion, but to help direct it in proper channels, not to give people what they think they want at a time of emotional stress, but to make them want what they ought to have." The vice president reports from a 4-page secret memo to Eisenhower, Secretary of State Christian A. Herter, and Allen Dulles. I thought John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State in 1959. Maybe I'm wrong there, but yeah, at that time, Christian A. Herter was the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, who I believe was maybe, or is on his way to being at least, the CIA director in a very, very crucial time for the agency. If he's not going to be the CIA director, he's going to be the CIA director very, very soon, folks. So that is really all you need to know about that. But it was apparent that he paid lip service to such institutions as freedom of speech, press, and religion, and his primary concern was with developing programs for economic progress. And that's the thing. That is such a big part of the dynamic at play here, because economic progress means different things for the two parties at the table, of course, with the allocation of resources and how businesses there are allowed to really be able to thrive, and what interactions are going to be had with the states, both the state of Cuba and the state of the United States. So Nixon included that Castro is either incredibly naive about communism or is under communist discipline, but he also expresses his own appraisal of Castro as a man. The one fact we can be sure of, he says, is that he has those indefinable qualities which make him a leader of men. Whatever we may think of him, he's going to be a great factor in the development of Cuba, and very possibly in the development of the Latin American affairs generally. So Richard Nixon if he was right about one thing, he was right about that. And that is just months after Castro installs himself. July 8th, 1959, a CIA briefing for the National Security Council reports on preparations in Cuba for efforts against the Dominican Republic. Meanwhile, Ambassador Bonsall of the United States met with Fidel Castro in Cuba. The ambassador expresses, quote, "our serious concern at the treatment being given American private interest in Cuba." What did I tell you there? Both agricultural and utilities. Castro responds by saying he admires Americans, especially tourists, for whom he is planning great things. So that's not who exactly the American state wants you to admire. They want you to admire the private industry, and also, as they say, those casinos. That's an awful mafia accent, but you know what I mean. Let's turn the page now a few months to October 1959, where President Eisenhower approves a program proposed by the Department of State in agreement with the CIA to support elements in Cuba opposed to the Castro government. We're just 10 months in, and we are already beginning to see the first rumblings of a serious movement to take out Fidel Castro. That is how many times they tried to take out this guy. So, I mean, when you're going up against the height of the United States government for that long, and I mean, you at least come out with your head in a time when they were really functioning, where they were undefeated. Got to give it to them there. But in the fall of 1959, Manuel Aritime participated in a secret 2-day meeting of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform in Havana. Numerous high officials of the revolution, including Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, attended the meeting. According to his notes, he takes on this unforgettable reunion, later published in his book, Triacion, I don't know if I said that right there. The discussion focuses on the true goals of the revolution. He quotes Castro as defining democracy as this, quote, "the meeting of a group of men who know the road on which to take the people, that freely discuss the things that they're going to do, having in their hands all the power to state to do that." So really saying that he believes democracy as something that should be representative of the people. Castro decided the state will take all possession of land holdings, eliminating possession of all land holdings and eliminating private property. So this is something that, again, if you want to piss off America, that is the way to do it. At this point, the campesinos will not be told these plans. That was what they're going to not include. Those are the farmers, of course. That's how they refer to in Espanol. But Artime stresses that leadership and the leadership intends to deceive the Cuban public. This is what he says here. They want to deceive the Cuban public about the results of the revolution. So this meeting of this Creole Kremlin, according to Artime, provides a catalyst for the beginning of his rebellion. So let's find a little bit more about this guy, Manuel Artime, here. Pretty much I'd say the most important thing about him is he is going to be one of the kind of political former members of the revolution who would clearly, as you begin to see here, slowly make his own counter-revolution. So this guy, Manuel Artime, is traveling undercover to Mexico and making contact with other Cuban exiles from the LAR in Mexico. A Bible is used for coding messages, and Dr. Lee, and this is really kind of a common thing, the overthrowing of Evo Morales in Bolivia, and this kind of Christian-based coup of kind of what can kind of be described as the authentically pro-Cuban way, like that. Like it's not so much as anti-Christian or kind of indigenous in the way that Evo Morales' politics very explicitly was. It's more of a kind of pro-Cuban secular perspective, and very much reminiscent of the kind of missionaries that took these lands away from their indigenous people so many years ago, coming back and manifesting the kind of same energy all those centuries later. So, meanwhile, in a memorandum to Eisenhower, the Secretary of State, Christian Herter, described changing policy towards Cuba. All action of the United States government should be designed to encourage within Cuba and elsewhere in Latin America the opposition to the extremist anti-American course of the Castro regime. However, in achieving this objective, the United States should avoid giving the impression of direct policy or intervention against Cuba, except where defense of legitimate United States interest is involved. And that's where you have things like the CIA. J.C. King, head of the CIA's Western Division, wrote in a memorandum around December 11th, 1959, for Richard Bissell, CIA Director, and CIA Director Allen Dulles, stating that Castro had now established a dictatorship of the far left. So these are kind of the trigger words that are going to be setting people off right here in these very, very high circles of kind of American central command in terms of ensuring that America stays kind of number one over everything, political, social, economic, and military, especially in its own neck of the woods. 90 miles off the coast of Miami here, people. Come on. So yeah, this CIA memo states that violent action is the only means of breaking Castro's grip on power, listing as the U.S. objective to overthrow Castro within 1 year. King also recommends thorough consideration be given to the elimination of Fidel Castro, marking the first time the idea of the assassination has been committed to paper. And this is, again, Cuban Problems, the public memo, available on December 11th of 1959. You can look this stuff up. By the way, in January 1960, the CIA set up an official task force, WH4, Branch 4 of the Western Hemisphere Division, to implement President Eisenhower's request for an ambitious covert program to overthrow the Castro government. So, yeah, pretty much one of the best things about Dwight Eisenhower is he was kind of forced into the FDR legacy of politics that his foreign policy, or his actually domestic policy, remained to be surprisingly progressive. Of course, only for white people, but again, so was FDR there. So there is that. But because he still had to go outside that box. But at this time, FDR's relative lefty nature or posture on foreign policy, which pretty much boiled down to, at the most, working with and not absolutely hating Stalin, just the same way, and everything related to do with Russia the way Winston Churchill did, had completely evaporated with somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general who had that mindset completely and was now surrounded by these same super aggressive espionage type people who oftentimes formerly came from really kind of tough industries like oil and really were incredibly wealthy, incredibly high class, and really hated any kind of threat of socialism. Especially, again, as I said, 9 miles off the coast of Florida, folks, not good. January 12th, 1960, and again, throughout the month of January, sabotage and small bombing missions in Cuba increased in frequency. A plane dropped incendiary bombs in areas of Benoa, Caraballo, and San Antonio de Rio Blanco. Another plane coming from the north with U.S. markings dropped inflammable material on cane fields next to the Hershey factory, which had, of course, been shut down at the time. So, yeah, live phosphorus in January 1860 was dropped over cane plantations in Cuba. Several people are detained in Segura La Grande for trying to derail the Havana train. A plane dropped, a train bound to Havana. A plane dropped 4 100-pound bombs on the urban district. So yeah, they're just bombing Cuba for just whatever, willy-nilly, pretty much throughout the month of January. By February, the movement of the Recuperation of the Revolution releases its kind of ideas list or basic points of the preamble. Manuel Artime, this is again the kind of political leader of the anti-Castro Cubans, wrote that the MRR has been formed not only to overthrow Fidel Castro, and they're again coming out and saying this, they are gonna be the outside exile group that is again supposed to have no real great connection to the CIA, but in the American state, but no. He said not only to overthrow Fidel Castro, but permanently fight for an ideology of Christ, and of course that is capitalism, and for a reality of liberating our nation treacherously sold to the Communist International. Yeah, again, of course the projection about selling your nation to an international is lovely to see there. But meanwhile, planes are dropping bombs and burning more than 1,700 arrobas of cane in Trinidad, and other bombing attacks are taking place in Punta Alegre, Camagüey province, and the Adelaide refinery, and in the central España. So in a CIA briefing to the National Security Council reports on the visit of Soviet official Anastas Mikoyan to Cuba, the USSR, it states, had shifted from cautious attitude to one of active support. So that was something that would really put the Ruskies getting in on that Cuban